the cold, and he wiped it away hastily. The plane's nose dipped suddenly, and he jerked the control yoke back with all his strength, pulling the plane back to level. His heart skipped a beat, the adrenaline coursing through him. This wasn't a moment for panic, it was a moment for focus. He had to remain calm, keep the plane steady, make it through the storm. The wind picked up, howling like a freight train, and for a split second, Chuck thought he saw a dark shadow through the thick snow, maybe the outline of a mountain, or just his mind playing tricks. He squinted, trying to make sense of the swirling white abyss, but it was all the same, a blur, a void. Suddenly, the plane lurched again, harder this time, throwing him violently against the side of the cockpit. He grunted, his ribs aching as he tried to right the plane, but the gusts were stronger than he was, and his hands were starting to slip on the controls. The instruments in front of him flickered, and then everything went dark. No engine sound, no instruments, just the eerie silence of an impending crash. His stomach dropped, and a rush of panic surged through him, but he quickly crushed it down. There was no time for fear now. His breath was shallow, his body stiff, as the plane careened downward, spinning out of control. The world outside was nothing but white noise and chaos. And then everything went black. Chuck's eyes snapped open, but the world around him remained a blur. His head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat. For a moment, he couldn't make sense of where he was. Was he still flying? Had the storm taken him down? His mind raced, struggling to process the fragmented images around him. The cold was unbearable, biting through his clothing and making his limbs feel like stone. The air was thick with the smell of fuel and the faint burn of metal. His body was pinned by something heavy. His ribs screamed in protest as he tried to move, but the pain was sharp and unrelenting. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to take slow, shallow breaths. Chuck blinked, trying to focus. The cockpit was a mess. Shattered glass, bent metal. The dashboard, once pristine, was now a twisted wreck of gears and wires. The left wing of the Cessna was crumpled against the snow, its tip buried in a jagged mound of ice. The fuselage was almost completely tilted to one side, as though the plane had tumbled violently before coming to a stop. He tried to push himself upright, but the pain in his chest intensified, and he winced, his breath coming in gasps. His hand brushed across his rib cage, and the sharpness of the injury made him realize something was wrong. 3 ribs, maybe more. He wasn't sure, but the crushing weight of them told him enough. Focus, he told himself. Stay calm. His military training kicked in. He needed to assess his situation. First, he checked his legs. They were numb, but no bones felt broken. He couldn't feel his left foot, maybe pinned by something, but he could wiggle his toes, a faint sign of life. He couldn't afford to waste energy panicking. There was still a way out of this, but he had to keep moving. Chuck forced himself into a sitting position, gritting his teeth against the pain. His mind was fuzzy, but the immediate survival instincts kicked in. Water, food, shelter. He glanced around the wreckage, trying to make sense of it all. The cargo in the back of the plane had scattered, some of it still intact, some torn open. A few cans of food rolled against the cockpit wall, their labels barely visible under the frost. Ration it later, he thought. First, make sure I can survive the cold. He looked down at his left hand, which had been cut and bruised in the crash. It didn't look serious, but it still hurt. Chuck turned his head slowly, scanning the area outside. Snow. Endless white. No sign of movement. No signs of life. A sense of isolation began to settle in, cold and suffocating. The storm outside had only grown worse, and he realized with a sickening jolt that the blizzard was still raging. There was no one out there, just him. He had no choice but to survive. He pulled himself toward the back of the plane, ignoring the pain in his chest as he reached for the emergency supplies. His fingers were stiff, but he managed to grab the small first aid kit, a mylar blanket, and a knife. He still had his signal mirror too, just in case someone managed to find him. He wasn't sure how long he could last, but as long as he was alive, there was still a chance. Chuck's breath came in shallow gasps as he surveyed the wreckage of his plane. The cold was already seeping through his clothing, and his body was shaking with the onset of hypothermia. He had to act fast, every moment spent lingering in the crash. Sight was another step closer to death. His ribs ached with each movement, and his body felt stiff from the crash and the freezing temperatures. He reached over to the side of the cockpit and grabbed his survival knife, wincing as the motion stretched his injured side. The blade felt cold and unfamiliar in his hands, but it was sharp. It had to be. With determination, he cut away a piece of the plane's seat fabric, using it to pad his makeshift shelter. The seat itself had been crumpled, its steel frame twisted, but he could still use it to shield himself from the worst of the wind. The snow outside had already begun to accumulate around the wreckage, turning the world into a white void. If he didn't make a shelter now, he'd never make it through the night. He worked quickly, grabbing anything that could provide warmth or protection. A few broken pieces of the plane's dashboard lay scattered nearby, and Chuck managed to pull a couple of panels free. They weren't much, but they might serve as rudimentary insulation or a windbreak. Next, he turned to the plane's cargo. Most of it was too damaged to be useful, but he managed to locate a few small packets of jerky and some emergency rations. He tore open the jerky, chewing it slowly to preserve his limited water supply. The meat was tough, and his teeth were sore from the cold, but it was food, and that was all that mattered: water. That was his next priority. He could survive for weeks without food, but only a few days without water. He scanned the wreckage again and spotted the plane's fuel tank. It was intact. Maybe, if he could melt some snow, he could use it to replenish the small amount of water he had left in his body. He limped over to the tank, his left leg still stiff from the crash. His body protested with every step, but he ignored it. There would be no rest if he didn't keep moving. With trembling hands, Chuck opened the fuel tank and removed the cap. The liquid inside was still too cold to drink, but he could use it to help melt snow. With great effort, he dragged the tank toward the front of the plane, positioning it near the engine. He lit a small fire, using some of the broken pieces from the dashboard, carefully feeding it until the flames caught. The wind howled outside, but he managed to get a small flame going, just enough to start melting the snow he had piled nearby. As the first drops of water formed, Chuck let out a sigh of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He cupped his hands around the liquid, sipping slowly, feeling it slide down his dry throat. It was cold, but it felt like life. His thoughts drifted back to the wreckage and the storm outside, alone, stranded, but still alive, and as long as he was alive, there was a chance. The days bled together in a haze of cold and hunger. Chuck's world had shrunk to the small makeshift shelter he'd created in the wreckage of his plane. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and the blizzard had become his constant companion: howling winds, swirling snow, and an unrelenting bitter cold. At first, Chuck had been focused on survival, each moment consumed by the basic necessities of life: water, food, warmth. The days seemed to stretch into eternity, each one dragging on longer than the last. The first few days had been filled with adrenaline, his mind sharp, his body moving on instinct. Now the exhaustion had set in. His body ached with every movement, his muscles stiff, his ribs pulsing with sharp, constant pain. He spent much of his time huddled in the shelter he'd made from the plane's wreckage, trying to preserve what little heat he could generate. He would sip the melted snow, chew on the jerky, and close his eyes, imagining he was somewhere far away from this frozen hellscape, somewhere safe. somewhere warm. But no matter how hard he tried to keep his mind occupied, the isolation began to gnaw at him. The silence outside, broken only by the wind, pressed in on him. Suffocating. He was alone. There were no rescue teams, no search parties. He hadn't seen a single plane fly overhead, and the radio, now a useless hunk of static, offered no hope. He was trapped in a white void, with nothing but the occasional glimmer of light through the snow to remind him that there was still a world beyond the storm. The cold was the worst part. It seeped into his bones, dulling his thoughts, slowing his movements. His hands were numb, his feet stiff, and though he had done his best to fashion some kind of shelter, the mylar blanket and the broken pieces of plane weren't enough to stave off the bitter chill. He had no firewood, no shelter beyond the wreckage. The snow kept piling up, and the wind continued to batter him. Every time he closed his eyes, he wondered if anyone was out there looking. For him. He had no way of knowing how long he'd been stranded. Days? Weeks? The storm had obscured everything. He had no idea if the searchers had even begun looking, or if they had written him off as lost, another casualty of the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. But despite the overwhelming odds, something in Chuck refused to give up. Maybe it was the grit instilled in him by years of military training, or maybe it was simply the stubbornness of a man who refused to let the wilderness win. With each passing day, he rationed his food even more carefully, trying to make it last. He saved what little water he could melt, but it was never enough. His body, weakened by hunger and cold, was beginning to betray him. The frostbite on his fingers and toes was worsening, and the pain in his chest was growing sharper. But Chuck didn't let himself dwell on it. He couldn't afford to. Instead, he focused on the one thing he could control: surviving. And every moment he held on, he was one step closer to the possibility of rescue. Back in civilization, the news of Chuck's disappearance spread quickly. His family had reported him missing within hours of his scheduled return, and soon the word was out. Chuck Hanley, experienced bush pilot and Vietnam veteran, had vanished somewhere over the Wrangell-St. Elias mountains. The search began almost immediately. Alaska's vast expanse, with its 13 million acres of wilderness, posed a nearly impossible challenge for the search teams. The snowstorm had swept in so suddenly that no one knew exactly where Chuck's plane had gone down. There was no distress signal, no mayday call, just the eerie silence of a missing man swallowed by the storm. The first few days were frantic. Volunteers, the Civil Air Patrol, and Alaska state troopers mobilized as quickly as possible, but their efforts were hindered by the ferocity of the blizzard. The heavy snow, high winds, and low visibility made it almost impossible to locate anything on the ground, let alone a small crashed aircraft. The snow kept falling, turning the landscape into a pristine, deceptive canvas. A needle in a haystack, they called it, except the haystack was endless, and the needle was the size of a wrecked plane. Chuck's wife, Liz, stayed by the phone, praying for any sign of him. She knew he was tough, had always been tough, but this was different. The blizzard, the vast, unforgiving wilderness. It didn't care how tough you were. She kept her faith, though. She knew Chuck, and if anyone could survive, it was him. But as the days passed with no word, that faith started to feel hollow. The weather hadn't cleared. Search teams combed the area, flying over the same stretches of snow and trees, hoping for any glimmer of hope, any clue that might lead them to Chuck. But every sweep of the plane's radar came back empty. Searchers began to fear the worst. There was no sign of the plane, no broken trees, no disturbance in the snow. It was as if Chuck and his plane had simply vanished from the earth. The possibility that he had survived, alone and stranded, began to feel like a distant hope. By the end of the first week, search efforts had slowed. The storm still raged. The recovery teams, exhausted and disheartened, focused their efforts on searching the most likely areas, the valleys and ridges where the plane might have gone down. But the terrain was rough and hard to navigate, and the blizzard made it nearly impossible to see anything. Then, on the 14th day, something changed. A spotter plane, scanning the snow-covered landscape from above, noticed something unusual, an unexpected flash of light. The midday sun glinted off something metallic, reflected sharply in the brilliant whiteness of the snow. It was a signal mirror, a tiny, almost imperceptible glimmer, angled just so to catch the sun. The searchers had their first real lead. The glint of the mirror was a sign that Chuck Hanley, against all odds, might still be alive. The moment the spotter plane reported the glint, a wave of disbelief rippled through the search team. A signal mirror. Could it really be? In a landscape so vast and unforgiving, where every sign had seemed swallowed by the storm, this tiny flash of hope stood out like a beacon in the wilderness. The team leader, an experienced Civil Air Patrol officer named Jim McKenzie, wasted no time. He immediately coordinated with the helicopter crews, giving them new coordinates, the approximate location of the flash. Despite the overwhelming odds, a flicker of possibility had surfaced. Someone had survived. Ground teams were dispatched with urgency, but the terrain was a nightmare. The snow was deep, the wind still howling through the valley, and visibility was poor at best. Even in daylight, the endless white stretched out, disorienting and vast, with little to distinguish one part of the wilderness from another. It was a frozen labyrinth, and though they knew Chuck's signal mirror had reflected the sun, there was no guarantee they would reach him in time. The helicopter flew low, skimming over the dense forest and snowbanks, its engine cutting through the blizzard. The crew scanned the ground for any sign of movement. Below, the ground seemed to stretch on forever, a sprawling wilderness of trees, rocks, and snow. But the signal glint had been unmistakable. It was a shot in the dark, but it was a shot nonetheless. Hours passed as they circled the area, cutting through thick clouds of snow. Then, from the corner of his eye, one of the crew members saw it. Another flash, weaker this time, but still there. "There! Over there!" he shouted, pointing toward the distant snowbank. Jim McKenzie barked orders to the helicopter pilot, guiding them toward the flashing signal. The helicopter descended lower, its blades whirring louder as they neared the ground. As they approached, Chuck's makeshift shelter became visible, a pile of wreckage and snow with broken pieces of plane debris scattered around. And just beyond it, through the swirling snow, a figure appeared, sitting on the ground, barely moving. Chuck. The helicopter touched down about 100 yards away, and the crew rushed out. The cold hit them immediately, a sharp, biting chill that cut straight through their clothes. Jim McKenzie led the charge, pushing forward through the snow with his team in tow. They moved quickly but carefully, making sure to avoid disturbing anything that might give away Chuck's fragile position. When they finally reached him, Chuck's face was pale, his eyes half closed, his body frozen stiff from the cold. He was still breathing, but barely. His clothes were torn, and his skin was marked with frostbite. He had clearly been through hell. "Chuck, you're going to be all right," Jim said, kneeling beside him. Chuck barely registered the words. He blinked slowly, his mouth cracked, dry. His lips trembled. His body shivered uncontrollably from the shock of being found, his mind too weak to process what had just happened. Jim carefully helped him to his feet, the team supporting him as they moved him toward the helicopter. Chuck's legs gave way once, and he collapsed, but the team steadied him, moving him with what little strength they had left. The search had lasted nearly 2 weeks, but against all odds, Chuck Hanley had survived. The helicopter's blades screamed against the cold as it lifted off from the snow-covered ground, carrying Chuck and his rescuers away from the wreckage of his crash site. The world below was nothing but a white expanse, the storm still raging as it had for what felt like eternity. But above, in the belly of the helicopter, Chuck felt the strangest sensation of warmth. Physical, yes, but more than that, a warmth deep within, a feeling of being pulled from the abyss. His body felt like lead, his limbs stiff and unresponsive, but his mind, still clouded by exhaustion and hunger, began to piece together the reality of what had just happened. He had been found. He had survived. Chuck could barely keep his eyes open, his head resting against the cold window. Every bump and jolt of the helicopter felt like an assault on his battered body. But somehow, it wasn't as bad as the grueling days he had spent alone in the wilderness. There, he had fought just to stay awake, just to keep moving. Now, all he wanted to do was rest, to close his eyes and drift into the warmth of sleep. But sleep would have to wait. The team didn't speak much as the helicopter flew back toward civilization, only the hum of the engine filling the space. Chuck's thoughts swirled in and out like the storm outside, whirling, chaotic, yet strangely soothing in their own way. It felt unreal, like he was still trapped in some sort of dream, the kind you wake from in a cold sweat, not quite sure if it was real. The reality of his survival was beginning to sink in. He had made it. He had fought through 14 days of snow, isolation, and bone-chilling cold. He had rationed what little food he had, melted snow for water, and, most incredibly, used his signal mirror to reflect the sunlight, guiding the searchers to him. It was the one thing that had kept him going, the thought that someone, somewhere, might still be looking for him. As they neared the rescue center, the pilot radioed ahead to alert the medical team. Chuck could hear the static crackle through the comms, and though his body ached in ways he didn't think possible, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The worst was over. He had made it. When the helicopter finally landed, Chuck was gently assisted out of the craft and onto a waiting stretcher. The medical team was quick to assess him, checking his frostbite and injuries. They wrapped him in blankets, offering him a warm IV drip to begin the process of rehydrating his parched body. The warmth from the blankets was almost too much, too fast. It burned, but in a way that told him his body was beginning to thaw, coming back to life. "Chuck, you're going to be all right," a medic said, her voice calm, but Chuck couldn't find the strength to respond. His eyelids fluttered shut, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to slip into unconsciousness. The storm raged on outside, but inside the warmth of the medical tent, Chuck Hanley, survivor, could finally rest. His battle was over, but the story of his will to survive, against all odds, was just beginning. Chuck's eyes fluttered open, the soft beep of medical equipment and the faint murmur of voices pulling him from a deep, dreamless sleep. The warmth that surrounded him felt foreign, almost overwhelming. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't battling the brutal cold, the howling wind, or the endless isolation. He was in a hospital bed now, clean sheets beneath him, warmth all around. But his body was still numb, and the familiar weight of exhaustion pressed heavily against his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off, that he hadn't fully returned from the wilderness. His body had been rescued, but his mind, it was still out there, lost in the snow with the wreckage of his plane. A soft voice broke his reverie. "You're safe, Chuck. You're going to be all right." Liz's face appeared in his line of sight, her eyes filled with relief, with a tinge of disbelief. She looked worn, like she hadn't slept in days, but she was there, and her presence grounded him. For a brief moment he couldn't bring himself to speak. His throat was dry, his mouth parched, and the words felt too heavy to form. "Chuck, it's okay," Liz said, taking his hand in hers. She stroked it gently, her fingers trembling slightly. You're here. You made it. He tried to speak, but the words were swallowed by the tightness in his chest. Instead, he squeezed her hand, his grip weak, but present. Alive, he thought. Still here. The nurse at his side smiled warmly, checking his vitals before adjusting the blankets around him. She noticed his struggle to speak and offered him a cup of water. Slowly, he took it, his hand shaking as he raised it to his lips. The cool water soothed his dry throat, but it also brought with it a sense of vulnerability, as if each sip reminded him of how far he'd fallen, how close he had come to the edge. His mind flashed back to the crash, to the storm, to the crushing pain in his chest as he crawled through the snow, fighting for every breath, every shred of hope. He remembered the signal mirror, the way it glinted in the snow like a beacon, how he had managed to angle it just right, reflecting the faintest light into the white void. It was his last act of defiance against the wilderness, and it had worked. But now, here he was with his wife beside him, the nightmare of those 2 weeks slowly melting away in the warmth of the hospital room. "How long?" Chuck managed to croak, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar. Liz smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. 14 days, Chuck. 14 days in that storm. But you made it. You fought your way through it. He closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. 14 days. He had lived, but he wasn't sure how. His body was battered, but his spirit somehow was still intact. He had survived, yes, but what came next? As Liz sat beside him, Chuck let out a shaky breath. The road ahead would be long, physically and emotionally. He would have to heal, piece by piece, just as he had done in those freezing days alone in the wilderness. But for now, he allowed himself the smallest moment of peace. He was no longer alone. He was safe. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem so uncertain. Chuck's body healed more quickly than anyone expected, scars knitting closed and frostbite retreating under skilled care. Yet the hardest wounds resisted bandages and antibiotics. The ache in his chest that flared when he breathed deeply, and the lingering tremor in his hands whenever the wind picked up. Back in town, he was celebrated as a hero, his story retold around wood stove gatherings and at the tiny airstrip cafe. "You're a legend, Chuck," people would say, clapping him on the shoulder, but the weight of those words felt heavy, as if the wilderness still clung to him, refusing to let go. Each morning he awoke to the bright Alaskan sun, filtered through frost-edged windows, and for a moment he was back in the storm, wind shrieking, snow drumming on the wings. Memories came unbidden, the snap of metal as the plane hit the ground, the bittersweet relief of seeing the signal mirror flash in the sun. Sometimes he saw the expanse of white outside his window and froze, paralyzed by the thought of being alone again. Other times he found himself automatically checking the sky, half expecting to see a plane's shadow sliding over the snow. Liz tried to coax him back to normal life. She suggested rebuilding the cockpit in their garage as a workshop, invited him to join friends on a fishing trip, and gently nudged him back toward flying lessons, this time in more controlled conditions. But Chuck resisted. The cockpit no longer felt like home. It felt like a sealed tomb. He declined the fishing trip and spent long afternoons staring out at the peaks beyond town, reliving each day of those 14 endless nights. Therapy helped in small doses. He spoke of fear and hope, of rationing jerky and melting snow, of the tooth-shattering cold and the utter solitude. His therapist helped him name his feelings: panic, isolation, survivor's guilt, but naming did not erase the tremors that jolted him whenever a storm rolled in. He would pause mid-sentence, his breath catching as if he were bracing for the crash all over again. Still, life carried on. The supply run route that had once been his daily ritual was flown by another pilot. The warehouse where he loaded cargo stood empty on his days off, a reminder of the flight that ended in disaster. He visited the crash site once on a clear, still day. The wreckage was gone, pulled away by crews and reclaimed by the earth. All that remained was the memory, etched into the land like a silent monument. Locals built a modest memorial near the airstrip, a polished granite slab engraved with his name and the date of the crash. "Refuse to give up," it read. Chuck stood before it in the waning light, the mountains framing the plaque like sentinels. He traced the letters with a gloved finger, feeling a rush of pride tangled with grief. He had survived, yes, but at what cost? As winter melted into spring, Chuck found himself drawn back to flying, tentatively at first. His therapist rode along on training flights, a calming presence in the co-pilot seat. Each takeoff was a victory, each smooth landing a small triumph over the fear drilled into him by that blizzard. He would never be the same pilot he was before November 1972. But perhaps that wasn't a bad thing. Some losses, he realized, could teach you strength in ways you never expected. By summer's end, Chuck climbed into a refurbished Cessna, engine humming beneath him. He eased down the runway and lifted into the sky, sunlight dancing off the wings. Below, the Wrangell-St. Elias peaks shimmered in the distance. He inhaled deeply, steady despite the memories that lurked in every gust of wind. The wilderness was still wild, but Chuck was back, scarred, wary, and stronger for having faced its fury. In the warm glow of Liz's living room, Chuck sat across from a small circle of friends and family, the hum of conversation and clink of mugs on the coffee table oddly comforting. Outside, a late spring breeze stirred the budding leaves, but inside, the storm of his memory raged fresh and fierce. He cleared his throat, every eye on him, and began. "I thought I might die out there," he said quietly, voice trembling. He dragged a hand across his stubbled jaw, searching for the man he'd been before the blizzard swallowed him. After the crash, I was disoriented. Couldn't tell up from down in the wreck. I broke 3 ribs, maybe more. My side felt like it was split in 2. His breathing hitched as he recalled the pain. He paused, eyes drifting to the window as if the first flakes of that whiteout might still swirl beyond the glass. Then, drawing in a slow breath, he continued. "I found the emergency pack in the wreck, some jerky, a first aid kit, and my signal mirror. I used the dash cover to build a windbreak, huddled inside the cockpit shell. At night, the cold crushed me. I tore apart the foam seat to stuff between the metal frame and my jacket, just to keep from freezing solid." He shifted in his chair, wincing at the memory. His sister, Maria, reached out and placed a steadying hand on his arm. Chuck nodded gratefully and pressed on. Water was the biggest fight. I found the fuel tank intact and thought, maybe I could somehow melt snow without contaminating it. I built a little fire with pieces of the dashboard wiring and wood from a broken panel, kept it small, just enough heat to trickle snow into liquid. Every sip felt like gold, though it stung my throat with its cold. The circle was silent, leaning in. Chuck's voice gained strength as the telling freed something inside him. Food ran low fast. Jerky was all I had. Tough, chewy, but protein. I rationed every shred. Some days I barely had half a strip. I kept thinking, if I can just make it through one more day, one more night. His gaze locked on Liz's, and he offered a sad smile. That mirror saved me. I angled it against the sun's glare, over and over, until finally that spotter plane banked low and saw it. I still can't believe it worked. He absorbed a collective exhale as the room let him finish. Chuck leaned back, the weight lifting slightly now that the story was whole. "I survived 14 days of hell," he said softly. "But every time I close my eyes, I'm back there, shivering, bleeding, alone. Telling you all of this, it helps. It reminds me I'm not that man anymore. I'm here, with you." Liz wiped a tear from her cheek and reached for his hand. Chuck looked around at the faces, his family, his friends, and felt their warmth like a shield against the cold he'd left behind. "Thank you," he whispered, "for listening, for believing." And in that circle of light and love, the final echoes of the whiteout began to fade, replaced by something stronger: connection, survival, and the courage to keep telling the story. News of Chuck Hanley's survival spread beyond the small towns and airstrips of Alaska to websites, campfire gatherings, and pilot lounges around the world. His story, once a whisper among those who knew the hazards of bush flying, became a beacon of resilience. Articles detailed how a Vietnam vet had outlasted 14 days of blizzard without a radio call, using nothing but jerky, melted snow and the glint of a signal mirror. People listened, riveted by the stark reminder that the line between life and death could hinge on the smallest spark of ingenuity. In McCarthy, where the airstrip was little more than a cleared patch of gravel, locals erected a modest glass case at the base of the windsock. Inside, a replica of Chuck's signal mirror rested on a bed of snow-white sand. Beneath it, a placard read, "When hope is buried in snow, reflections will guide you home." Pilots who landed there paused to read it, tipping their caps in respect before climbing down to the cafe for coffee and fresh jerky. Pilots and survival instructors began citing Chuck's experience in training sessions. They spoke of the importance of maintaining emergency gear, of knowing how to melt snow without poisoning yourself, of never underestimating the value of a simple tool like a mirror. The story became a case study discussed in hushed tones at aviation safety conferences, where veterans and rookies alike dissected every decision Chuck had made. His choice to preserve the mirror, his improvisation of a shelter, his unyielding will to survive. But the real legacy was quieter and more personal. A teenage pilot named Emma, flying her first solo supply run, told her instructors she'd carry 2 mirrors after reading Chuck's story. A search and rescue volunteer in Montana said he'd look twice at every glint on the snow, thanks to Hanley's signal. In remote villages across Alaska, elder pilots recounted the tale by lantern light, weaving Chuck's name into the tapestry of wilderness lore. Liz watched the ripple effect with a mixture of pride and awe. She kept a scrapbook of every article, every photograph, every testimonial, pages filled with yellowing newspaper clippings and glossy magazine spreads. But her favorite was a handwritten letter from a young pilot in Norway who wrote that Chuck's grit had inspired her to train as a search and rescue volunteer. "Because of him," she wrote, "I'll be ready when someone needs me." For Chuck, the accolades felt surreal. He still flinched when the wind picked up, but each time he did, he reminded himself that the wilderness was no longer a prison, but a teacher. He started visiting schools in Anchorage, speaking to students about survival skills and the power of perseverance. He passed around a real signal mirror, now etched with tiny scratches from use, and showed them how a single beam of light could carry a message across miles of snow. Years later, Chuck returned to the original crash site on a calm summer morning. The snow had melted, replaced by wildflowers nodding in the breeze. He knelt, placed a small mirror on a rock, and watched as the sunrise caught its surface, sending a steady glint across the valley. It wasn't just a reflection of sunlight, he thought, but of every life changed by his story. And as that light danced over the peaks, Chuck Hanley realized his legacy was more than survival. It was the spark of hope he'd lit in others, a signal mirror guiding countless souls home. The cockpit was quiet except for the gentle hum of the engine and the soft whir of the propellers. Cutting through the thin Alaskan air, Chuck Hanley adjusted his headset, feeling the familiar weight of the yoke beneath his hands. It had been 3 years since the crash, and each flight still carried an undertow of tension, an echo of the storm that nearly claimed his life. Yet today felt different. Today he was in control. He taxied the refurbished Cessna down the gravel strip at McCarthy, its wheels kicking up tiny pebbles as he eased into takeoff. The wind was calm, the sky a polished blue. Below, the wildflowers that carpeted the tundra in summer swayed gently. He thought of the snow-blanketed valley he'd once crawled through, of the terror and the cold, and he let it remain where it belonged, in the past. As the plane lifted into the sky, Chuck's heart swelled with a quiet joy. He climbed higher, angling toward the distant peaks of Wrangell-St. Elias, their jagged summits crowned with snowfields that glowed in the morning light. For a moment he closed his eyes, letting the vibration of the engine and the rush of wind wash over him. He inhaled deeply, savoring the sensation of freedom, of flight, which had once felt like a curse. Up here, he thought, the world was both vast and intimate. Every ridge, every valley held a memory. But none weighed him down anymore. He was a different man, still marked by the crash, still wary of the wind, but stronger for having survived. Each scar, physical and emotional, had become a testament to endurance, not an anchor of fear. He reached into the center console and drew out the signal mirror he carried on every flight. The surface bore tiny scratches, reminders of how a single flash of light had saved his life. Chuck angled the mirror toward the sun, catching its rays and sending a bright beam across the cabin. The light danced over the instrument panel, and he allowed himself a small smile. This simple tool, once his last hope, was now a talisman of triumph. "Let's do a lap around the valley," he said into the headset, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. He banked the plane gently, following the contours of the mountains below. The landscape was peaceful, alive with summer colors and the distant calls of birds. He felt connected to the land, to the sky, and to the people who had never stopped believing in his return. Minutes later, as he made his final turn back toward the airstrip, Chuck's thoughts drifted to Liz waiting below. He imagined her standing by the windsock, waving as he circled in, her smile brighter than the sunlit peaks. He thought of Maria, of the search teams, of every stranger who had combed the snow in search of one man. They had been his lifeline, just as the mirror had been his guide. The wheels touched down smoothly on the gravel, and the Cessna rolled to a gentle stop. Chuck powered down the engine and removed his headset, his fingers lingering on the mirror's cool edge. He stepped onto the ground, inhaling the crisp air, and looked up at the sky he had reclaimed. He was home.